So I think I'll get us underway, given that, as you know, I like to go on a bit, and this will give a few people a chance for to get here. But I don't want to keep us all waiting, those of you who have managed to get here, and thank you very much. So my name is Mark Ledbury, for those of you that don't know, and I'm the director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney, and of course I'd first like to acknowledge that the lands of the University of Sydney is built on are the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish to pay my respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge a 50,000 year culture of learning. I'm delighted to welcome you here to our last Keir lecture for this academic year, and I'd like to thank the Keir Foundation for their support, which has made this lecture tonight and indeed Stephen's talks in Brisbane and Melbourne possible and he's speaking both here and then he goes on to Brisbane and then he goes on to Melbourne, so a veritable tour, and this is all made possible thanks to the generous funding of the Keir Foundation, which mandated us indeed to make sure we cooperated. We played nicely with other children, so to speak, and share our speakers with Melbourne and Brisbane, and it is a great thing and very encouraging to know that there's such a perhaps rare and unusual thing as actually collaborating with the other great humanities universities in the country comes about. And so I'm very grateful to the Keir Foundation. And I'm also, of course, very grateful to to the whole Power team, especially tonight to Kate Uclea, for helping with all these arrangements, these complex logistical arrangements, and making sure that things run smoothly. I would also like to thank Charles Green and Anthony White at Melbourne and Amelia Barrakin at the University of Queensland for their help with all of this. And before we get on to the meat of tonight, I couldn't let this opportunity go by, of course, to spruik another event next week. This is the third lecture in the Sydney Asian Arts series for the year. That's a series that is convened by Deputy Director of Power Stephen Whiteman, and it convened in conjunction with China Study Centre here at the University, Sydney Ideas and VisAsia, and with support from the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And this lecture series is bringing Tim Screech, Professor of the History of Art of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, obviously, and his title next week is The Shogun's Silver Telescope, Art in the First English Encounters with Japan, 1611 and to 1616. And that is in Old Geology Lecture Theatre on Thursday, the 23rd of August. That's next Thursday of next week. So you see, it was worth me going on and on because some people... no, I hope you'll be able to make it to that, and it's very exciting. But of course, tonight we're presenting one of the most important voices in African and African American art studies, Professor Stephen Nelson, who's Professor of African and African American Art and Director of the UCLA African Studies Center, obviously at the University of California, Los Angeles. Stephen was educated at Yale and Harvard and has previously taught at Tufts, but since 2001, I believe, has been at UCLA. And he's, of course, the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, too numerous for me to enumerate every one of them, including, obviously, Getty Research Institute. And it's just very excitingly been announced that from September, he will take up the very prestigious 2-year research professorship at CASVA as Andrew W. Mellon Professor, which is a marvellous 2 years with the brief to engage in your independent research and be a plank of the CASVA edifice. And what a great one. And so congratulations, Stephen, on that. So that's what his next 2 years will be. But of course, these honours only reflect what's really interesting about Stephen, and that is, of course, his work. He came to prominence as a brilliant historian of African art, particularly African art and its diasporic ripples, if you like. And his book, From Cameroon to Paris, Mosgoum Architecture in and Out of Africa, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2007, remains an exemplary study of such a complex and diasporically informed art history, something that will resonate with many here and in Australia who also think about diaspora a lot. And he focused on the widely disseminated sort of multiple inscriptions of an African architectural form, the distinctive teleuk. Informed the book is by sort of rather brilliant, sensitive reading of travellers' narratives, of analysis of the colonial exhibition in 1931 in Paris, and also contemporary
Cameroonian practices. And as well, the book is really informed by his own thoughtful methodological readings, both of African history and of art history writ large. And he's always posing the question, what kind of history can we write of African art in our own day? And this book's been followed by, in his African art sort of wing, if you like, by, for example, thoughtful discussions of Nelson Mandela's Two Bodies in Transition, a famous article, study of sex and representation in Dakar, and numerous chapters and articles reflecting a consistent methodological interest, but also a deeply political consciousness as an art historian. He's also had a long-time interest in African-American art and its histories. If one thinks of his chapter, Freeman Murray, in the beginnings of African-American history of art, in a volume I often set students, Cassie Mansfield's Art History and Its Institutions, way back in 2002. He's commented extensively on African-American artists in the academic and the wider press, and he's committed to thinking hard about art history and race. In fact, there's a good way of plugging tomorrow's student seminar for us, in which he's really trying to think through, for those of you that will come along tomorrow, one of the pieces that he's sent for reading is his piece, Rodney Mcmillan's Racial Unconscious, which explores the African-American artist's complex use of materials to probe kind of the American South and much else. But tonight, he's going to focus on Julie Mehretu, an artist of Ethiopian origin who's lived in the US since 1977 and whose work reflects the complex diasporic and American themes and preoccupations that Stephen's work has consistently probed. So we're really delighted that he's with us to present his lecture entitled Post Soul Gesamtkunstwerk, Julie Mehretu's Abstract Spectacle. Please welcome Stephen Nelson.
Good evening, everybody. Mark, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's fantastic to be here in Sydney, and as some of you know, it's my first time to Australia, and I'm tempted not to go back. A, because this place is fabulous, and B, the U.S. is not. So, but before we get on, I would like to thank Mark and also Stephen Whiteman, and who together invited me here. Stephen put a bug in my ear probably about 18 months ago or something, and Mark followed through. But I would also like to thank Keir, who has just done an amazing job of making it all work. Thank you very much. I also would like to acknowledge the Keir Foundation as well, without whose support I would not be here. And so this is terrific. So why don't we get into this? And basically tonight's discussion is a kind of work in progress, right? It is a sort of rumination. I'm doing some thinking out loud. But tonight's lecture springs from my manuscript in progress, titled Structural Adjustment, Mapping Geography and the Visual Cultures of Blackness. This text explores a group of contemporary African and Afro-Atlantic artists, including Mark Bradford. Oh, I'm trying to switch on the computer. What's that?
I omitted to switch your lights down, and so I'm just wondering whether I can just...
You can turn them off if you want. I don't need light.
Okay. Is this good for everyone?
Yeah, I'm an art historian.
We love
kind
the
of
dark.
a vampire. And so I feel much better now, don't you? All right, so Mark Bradford, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, Houston Conwell, Mashakwa Langa, and Julie Mehretu, who employ mapping and geography to address key concerns in their work. While all of these artists' strategies engage notion of site, place, and affiliation, in the meeting places of mapping and blackness, they produce works of unique visual power and complexity that reshape our understanding of African ancestry, notions of diaspora, and urban spaces. Maps have occupied a prominent position in modern and contemporary art since at least the early 1960s. Perhaps the best known and best addressed examples are those of Jasper Johns, who during the decade used the map as a launching pad for formal, linguistic, and political investigation. Afro-Atlantic artists also made liberal use of maps in their work to explore newfound pride in the motherland, to articulate Pan-Africanist and Black nationalist ideals, and in some cases, to critique the burgeoning American industrial military complex. Here, maps are part of political, psychological, and emotional exegeses on the relationship of subjects to geography, and they attempt to recast our understanding of both. Inspired by my own past as a graphic designer who made informational graphics and my 2006 article, Mark Bradford's Allegorical Impulse, and I should say that this is the only commission I've ever had in my life. Right? I was a baby designer back then. I'm fascinated at how each artist, as a geographer, plays with a mix of mediums to create monumental, phantasmic, and chaotic spaces that problematize the authority of official maps, while they remap new kinds of spaces that interrogate the relationships of groups of things, peoples, and ideology in new and at times uncomfortable ways. While I would love to talk about all of these artists today, tonight, after a brief digression into talking about maps and art through the example of artist Frank Bowling, I'm going to focus on the work of Mehretu. I hope that taken together, this example will outline the project's trajectory and stakes. And so I like to call this part map problems. Artist Frank Bowling, born in British Guiana, now Guyana, arrived in New York City in 1967 and quickly became immersed in the local art scene. It is here that he executed the large-scale map paintings exemplified by works such as South America Squared, 1967, and Untitledborn 1 from 1968 that he would include in his 1971 solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art. During this time, the artist also became a critic, and between 1969 and 1971, he published a series of 5 essays that attempted to theorize what we were calling black art at the time in Arts Magazine and in Art News, both in the face of the racially charged politics of the day, as well as within the context of modernist art and formalism. Concurrently with these essays, Bowling wrote another that he titled Another Map Problem, in which he explores maps in concert with abstract painting. In putting forth his definition of a map, Bowling directly quoted the 1967 Rand McMillan World Atlas, and he says, quoting the atlas, "A map is merely an orderly system of parallels and meridians on which a flat map can be drawn." It's really simple and really sort of lacking. The map system of parallels and medians, in Bowling's opinion, also has strong parallels in painting. In this realm, the map is an organizing structure that has a seemingly infinite capacity for the play of form and the manipulation of the painting surface. In short, the map should be part and parcel of the painting's self-referentiality. As part of his text, Bowling takes issue with Larry Rivers' 1963 painting, Africa 2 in 5 parts, which for the artist constitutes a, quote, vague use of the map as it refers to the world outside of the painting. But what of Bowling's own concurrent map paintings? Despite what the artist writes, the maps on these canvases also refer to worlds outside of the work, and they also infer that a map is a heck of a lot more than what he said they were in, quoting the 1967 atlas. These exist as exegeses on migration, on diaspora, on autobiography, and the dominance of mainstream modernist painting. Placing the artist's work against the grain of his essay reveals a complex ambivalence around the form of the map and its application to modernist art. This tension, however, has been suppressed in the literature on the artist in favor of less nuanced readings that claim the map for map images in his work, for the Black nationalist politics of the time, and for post-colonial revisions of 1960s art. These readings aren't incorrect per se, so I'm not going to trash a whole group of scholars who say these things, but they tend to leave behind the complicated relationship Bowling had to the map, and how such tensions are engaged not only in the artist's work, but also in the ways he tries to theorize Black art and reconcile it with his own formal and formalist bent. But at the end of the day, Bowling really had it both ways. He could talk about the map as structure and about lines and about a set of formal operations, yet he could also take advantage of the map signifying possibilities. Bowling's multiple understandings of the map and his ambivalence around the form serve as springboard for Structural Adjustment's 5 chapters. As structure, as signifier, as mirror, as icon and/or symbol. This project explores the myriad uses of the map and the confrontations such interactions produce. Moreover, understanding the map not just as formal structure for art making, but also as psychological structure, emotional ordering, and a system of establishing relationships in the world, this text investigates how artists at the crossroads of mapping and blackness produce works of visual power and complexity that reshape our understanding of African ancestry, notions of diaspora, and our senses of urban spaces. Moreover, Structural Adjustment considers how these artists, Bradford, Campus Pons, Conroe, Langa, and Mehretu, incorporate maps as well as the tools of the cartographer and geographer in attempts to short-circuit the map's ideological structures of authority, offering instead provocative revisions of the worlds they explore. So let's get to the main story here, all right? Post-Sol Gesamtkunstwerk, Julie Mehretu's Abstract Spectacle. In 2000, Julie Mehretu completed Back to Gondwanaland, consisting of ink and acrylic paint on canvas and measuring 8 by 10 feet. So it's a large painting. This work was part of the artist's move away from earlier pieces that, in her words, had a diagrammic, map-like, pictographic element to them. This particular painting, like Mehretu's work in general, is multi-layered. Underneath gestural strokes in various colors are delicate, transparent ink drawings, almost like architectural renderings that depict building fragments, footsteps of different creatures, topography, and even plant life. Although the artist notes that her works are moving away from the map-like and the diagrammatic, the layer that exists under her gestural bursts retain a kind of drafting normally reserved for informational graphics, diagrams, maps, and architectural rendering. It is as if the brush has been set out to attack the controlled drawings, succeeding in bothering and compromising the delicacy below. It would also seem that as if the work's layers, instead of leaving the map behind, instead of leaving behind these characters that she describes as diagrammatic, retain mapping as an organizing structure, as a comprehensive and complex way of systematizing her canvases. At least since the turn of the 21st century, the majority of Mehretu's work has consisted of large, sometimes monumentally scaled works that appear at first glance as all-encompassing aerial views. Whatever their size or density, these works stage confrontations between drawing and painting, between the control associated with the former and the freedom so often accorded to the latter. These confrontations between mediums, between the Apollonian nature of the artist's drawing and the Dionysian possibilities of her painting, have been the subject of many conversations on the artist's work. And within these, this fundamental tension and calling out the conflicts between the syntax of rendering and that of gestural paint, and sometimes dramatic color, has been understood as political statements confronting abstraction. Related to such observations, Mehretu, like Mark Bradford, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work, is often seen as an urban geographer, someone who follows closely the eruptions and the erasures that are the ebb and flow of the lives of cities. The resulting canvases are, for art historian Joan Young, quote, narratives of urban development and the built environment and their impact on an individual's experience. It is true that Mehretu's canvases, whether brightly colored or muted, deal with questions surrounding not only deconstruction and construction in their dance with rhetorics of international development and in its concomitant effects around the world, but they're also total artworks that bring the viewer into imaginary, utopian spaces that do not narrate specific events, but rather explore and hold our attention in the gap between the concrete and the abstract, between the real and the unreal. To put this in formal terms, works such as Stadia 1 from 2004, depicting a transparent stadium overcome by dramatic worlds of paint and color, leaves us hanging between painting and drawing, in the gap between one syntax and another. And I should say, just to sort of think about the structure of this painting, it's made in part from architectural drawings, from plans of actual stadiums that she found and took apart and put back together, and then it's overlaid by these gestural swirls of paint. And in a way, what we're seeing is a kind of, I would like to say, even though it's only a few years after she claims to have done away with her little map-like creatures, that these characters, all right, that these characters that I would argue are very near and dear to her, do stick around. They stick around and they look a little different, but I think that they're still there, all right? So these are, but the painting as a whole, all right? The painting as a whole is an indecipherable and a non-linear world populated by competing modes of existence. And these modes perhaps mirror our own globalized, seemingly placeless present. They seem to be worlds that, in a conversation with the art historian Sarah Lewis, Mehretu called psychogeographies. All right, and hold on to that phrase. But what does Mehretu mean by the making of psychogeographies? And what is the contribution and implication of the map-like diagrammatic characters that might well have served as the basis of this formulation? Guy Debord, in the context of the Situationist International, defines psychogeography as, quote, the study of the specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behaviors of individuals. Predicated on what Debord saw as the increasing social and psychological deterioration of city dwellers as a result of post-war moves in what Dennis Cosgrove, the geographer, has called functionalist and rationalist urban planning models, based not on experience, but rather on statistics and models of thematic mapping, Debord and his colleagues turned towards maps as part of a larger strategy to enact radical challenges to the disembodiment of urban experience, most provocatively visualized by contemporary maps of cities that were made in the mid-1950s. Geographer Dennis Cosgrove, who I just mentioned, in thinking about the links between art and cartography, suggested that Debord's interest in these maps, which posit an omnipresent bird's eye view of a place, quote, perfectly captured the distant spatial vision of mid-century urban planning in European cities such as Paris, London, and Amsterdam, and that so enraged the Situationists. Directly taking on these maps, which they saw as the visual evidence of the alienation of their urban setting, in 1957, Debord and the Situationist International published the Guide Psychogeographique de Paris, or the Psychogeographic Guide to Paris, Discourse sur the Passion de l'amour, and another pamphlet called Naked City. So in this discourse on the passions of love and Naked City. In the guide, the Situationists take a copy of Peltier's 1956 map called Bird's Eye View of Paris. And they carefully cut it up into fragments, as you can see on the screen. And they call these fragments unities of ambience, which they then rearranged in a collage, which again you see. And the form of this is as if it's a kind of walking tourist map. It's not unlike the map the hotel gave my husband and I of Sydney yesterday, which we carried around with us, and I would stop and take out and unfold and figure out where I was and then proceed to get lost. But what they've done in this fold out, what the Situationists have done is very carefully parse out different blocks, different areas of Paris, and rearrange them, all right? And then connect them through these red arrows that really seem not to make a lot of sense if you were to try to sort of deal with them. But anyway, these fragments are meant to signify the possibility of intimacy. They're meant to underscore the possibility of interactions in space that are more personal. Artist and cartographer Dennis Wood understands the red arrows as drifters, where one fragment could move into another. He's thinking about these sort of disembodied, these fragmented pieces of cities as being from California, what I would call tectonic plates that move and shift, and that they could possibly move in the direction of these arrows and enact encounters with one another. Right? Cosgrove, on the other hand, sees those arrows as more informal ways of, more impersonal ways of getting around the city. So he thinks of them as, say, taking a taxi from one element to another. And whichever one of these interpretations you would buy or agree with, such an understanding, such readings suggest an understanding of the city as a series of plates, if you follow one Dennis, and events, if you follow the other Dennis, all right? But each of them, however you want to parse it out, are metaphors for human psychology, and the spatial experimentation that the situationist saw is vital to psychologically freeing oneself from the oppression signified by post-war urban life. In essence, The Guide and Naked City were visual demonstrations of the Situationist International's theses on cultural revolution that the group hoped would serve as a catalyst for radical political action. In rendering the maps totalizing views and the disembodied experiences they define and direct as non-functioning, the Situationist International saw art as an organizing structure that has the ability for subjects to, in Debord's words, quote, reproduce ourselves and not the things that enslave us. Mehretu's description of her own work from the mid-1990s, such as the 1996 paintings Ink City, and things like Middle Grey, which you see on the screen, share provocative affinities with the link between object and being inferred both by maps and by the Situationist interventions in them. At first, Mehretu said, the paintings were just composed of layers of drawing. There were a few characters that huddled together and created a community. As they migrated and mixed with other characters, they made new cities. Eventually, a whole terrain would be drawing upon and entangled with narrative. While Mehretu's comments are a potent allegory for her own childhood migration from Ethiopia to the United States, and she arrived in Michigan at the age of 7, as well as the subsequent places she has lived, New York, Berlin, and others, Rhode Island. They also suggest the possibility of different constructions of subjectivity in space. They also suggest that our movement and experience of space might not always be those circumscribed by all-encompassing maps and other documents. As Lewis rightly notes, in Mehretu's works, she says, individual characters have become signifiers of social agency that serve as, in Mehretu's words, a personal, semi-autobiographical thought experiment of her experience and a response to the social space she inhabits and challenges. Mehretu's total artworks, such as this that we see on the screen, formally challenge such spaces through the swirls of paint and jabs of ink that in their monumental scales take in, and in a fashion not unlike the work of Debord and the Situationists, disorient the viewers. And so these things are, they're emancipatory, but they're emancipatory through the process of defamiliarization and frankly, confusion. In Mehretu's constructions of the total artwork, or to be more precise, the Gesamtkunstwerk that lay at the base of her psychogeographies, it is these sort of moves to disorient that really give them their evocative force. In 1849, Richard Wagner insisted, quote, the great Gesamtkunstwerk must contain all of the branches of art in order, as it were, to use up, to destroy them for the benefit of retaining their common purpose. As art historian Julia Koss suggests, Wagner imagined the Gesamtkunstwerk in the wake of the revolutions that swept across Europe in the 1840s as a utopic, all-encompassing structure that would change the art as well as its audiences. Bringing together the visual and performing arts, it was deemed capable of immersing spectators into a totalizing experience wherein the boundaries between the different arts would be erased, and the boundary between you, the audience, and the things going on around you would also be erased. At the same time, everything would merge with everything else. And so this merger would be complete. There would be no you, me, art, not art. All right? In effect, public life and the artwork would live as one. Wagner's vision was grand, and in 1876, it resulted in the construction of the Ink City, losing my slides. It resulted in the construction of the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth, in Germany, designed by Otto Bruchwald and intended to host the premiere of Wagner's Ring Cycle, the world's longest opera. As is evidenced by her 2010 drawing Bayreuth, I'm out of order here, and in published interviews. Mehretu was well aware of Wagner's theater and its role as an integral element of the Gesamtkunstwerk. In Mehretu's hands, the Festspielhaus is reduced to a transparent drawing, and it is nearly deconstructed and obscured through the system of lines that overlay it. Certainly, a commentary on the forms of power amassed by architecture, it is also subsumed to the artist's own investigation of the Gesamtkunstwerk as a possible means for pushing and theorizing her own system of representation. Speaking about her process and about her relationship to languages of architecture with art historian Lawrence Chua, Mehretu questioned the primacy accorded to such articulations in defining space. We might think that her monumental paintings, is this going to work? I'll go back there. Some of them based on blueprints and architectural drawings, as I mentioned earlier, as being in and of themselves a kind of intervention into our understanding or simply our acceptance of the stability and authority of architecture. However, the process for the artist is much more intricate than just the swatches and the destruction. And I think it's more intense. And so what she says is, instead of just the architectural language delineating the space, the characters and swans actually develop and create the space. So she's displacing agency. The architectural language serves as a marker to the type and the history of the space, but the characters make the space and break it down. They actually complicate the space in the painting. For example, a bunch of dashes or marks will enter the painting a certain way, and then another group of marks enter it another way to completely contradict that. It's becoming more interesting to me how they're getting spatially complicated and formally complicated in terms of different vanishing points, but also how those become different perspectives within the space and impact exactly how the painting can be read. And so it's also comments like that that make me feel that when she says, I've lost the map like in the diagram like that, she didn't. And I won't say she's lying, but she didn't, right? And so if we think about Mehretu's thoughts from 2005 with respect to her work on Bayreuth, which is 5 years later, all right? It is clear that the marks and the characters that form the basis of her practice understand architecture as having been imbued with a similar kind of authority that we think of in terms of history with a capital H or truth with a capital T, and of maps, which also serve to define and give moral and political shape to space, and by extension to humans that interact in it. Or they do the opposite, they take it away from us. With such things in mind then, it is clear that unlike Wagner's vision, unlike his utopic gesture for a unified world of art and folk consolidated in the architectural world of the Gesamtkunstwerk, Mehretu is interested in this 19th century formation as a thing to be analyzed, as a strategy to think through what Wagner's ideas of the very possibility of a merger of art and human experience might entail. In deconstructing the Festspielhaus, Mehretu's work also exists as an exegesis on architecture's theatricality. On the one hand, concerning this issue, concerning the theatricality of architecture, Mehretu is interested in how it appears in Wagner's thought and in the sort of construction of these monumental works such as these, both in the terms of the specifics of Wagner's spectacular Ring Cycle, an opera with which she was familiar. In 2010, the same year she created Beirut, the artist was commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera on the occasion of director Robert Lepage's new production of the opera to create work that speaks to Wagner's epic. The resulting work is titled Auguries, a 12-panel etching, explores the theatricality of Wagner and of the Ring Cycle, and by extension architecture, but also it's filled with the characters that have so often populated her work. And so in a way, in this sense, it explores the opera's embodiment of and activation of the human qualities the composers sought for this Festspielhaus. Moreover, The Ring as a production was intimately connected to Wagner's intent and interest in the Gesamtkunstwerk. On the other hand, related to the connection between the Ring Cycle and Wagner's ideas on architecture, Mehretu is interested in architecture's position as a kind of theater of ideation. Beirut's deconstructive gesture cuts through such utopic notions, instead exploring the ideological and political charge of the built environment, particularly in light of 19th century nationalist and nationalistic formations raised by the Ring Cycle, Wagner's innovations in staging and production, and the construction of the Festspielhaus. Moreover, if we understand the theater itself as a space of community, a kind of home for the shared experiences centered on the spectacle of performance, then we can see Mehretu's intervention as a shattering of that illusion through the lines that cut, that deconstruct, that obscure the building itself. Wagner offered up the theater as a space of equality, proffered by the merger of art and folk. Mehretu unravels the composer's dream, exposing architecture's grand vision as being artifice, and the representation not of the dream of reality, but rather a vision that is a less than credible fiction. Mehretu points to the artifice of the Festspielhaus and its role in the construction and total experience, spectacle, and nationalist ideology. At the same time, this drawing, like works such as Stadio 1 and Raffian Logistics, exists as a mapping of spectacle itself. Moreover, and perhaps ironically, in the analysis and deconstruction of the Gesamtkunstwerk, Mehretu's works in bringing spectators into this new, psychologically charged world are Gesamtkunstwerken in their own right. They are part of what Annette Michelson acclaimed in 1991 as, quote, the specter of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which, in the art historian words, quote, haunted the theory and practice of the arts throughout the 20th century. Instead of Wagner's homely community of spectators with shared experiences, Mehretu's works form communion based on the unhomely, based on plurality, and based on difference. These formations are predicated on the suspicion surrounding the 19th century Gesamtkunstwerk and its monumental aspirations, and it coalesces around the very contradictions inherent in Wagner's wish for a democratizing movement around art and the mass public that in the end, as Andreas Huijsen notes, quotes, participates in the widespread 19th century imaginary of triumphal architecture, stable origins, and mythic groundings of the nation. Mehretu's Gesamtkunstwerke display their contingencies in the gaps between mediums. They hold up spectacles that exert their evocative force in the clash of layers. Yet leaving Beirut, which for all intents and purposes is a drawing with a concrete reference, in works such as Black City from 2007, which, like Stadio, which, like so many other works, brings together disparate syntaxes, also has a referent that isn't quite is concrete. It is a reference, however, to the city of Detroit, which was where she was raised near there, and she explains that she and her family would go to Detroit to do all of their business and the like. The marks she called, and others have called, surrogates for peoples and communities that coalesce in different urban spaces. And in that sense, they're not that different from the things that we've seen in her other work. Black City makes clear that Mehretu's total artworks, her psychogeographies, the systems through which she deconstructs and constructs her canvases, are inflected by operations inherent to formations of post-soul blackness. In this sense, post-soul blackness isn't a mark of subjectivity, and it's not engendered in my mind by this work's specific title. But it is, in the words of poet Kevin Young, quote, this tension between sacred and secular, between past and future, between degradation and redemption. Realizing degradation can be just what leads to redemption. Or in another sense, it could be, if you think about the blues, both Saturday night and Sunday morning. All right? Within this tension, Black artists are inheritors to a vast array of traditions and practices, and Mehretu uses these to rework a world of her own understanding. Young grounds the operations of post-soul blackness in structures such as bargaining, trading, stealing, making, and storying in his understanding of funk, and I mean the music, all right, and the bodily smells. In his conception of terms, funk is not ancestry, right? It is a more generalized notion of the past, a psychological past that threatens to unhinge a not so comfortable present. Given funk's groundedness in the body, given funk's specter of sexuality and bodily detritus, it might seem odd to invoke it as an operation for a series of canvases that seem to, at least on their surfaces, disregard the body. And at least on their surfaces, are really rather clean. But yet funk, as a stance, even as a set of operations, functions like the Gesamtkunstwerk. Like the total artwork, funk is a utopian gesture that strives for community, one that revels in the dissolution of boundaries and the multi-layering of meaning. It also moves towards spectacle and the outlandish. It is indirect, it is non-linear. Mehretu's own hope that her paintings constitute, quote, a Baroque over-the-top epic narrative nods to funk's predilection for storying, for imagining a spectacle that is contingent, sometimes contradictory, and usually quite fierce. Mehretu's funk parses out places, it reimagines time. The painting's layers not only erase and obscure, but they smash the past and present to such an extent that in the experience of viewing it, it is impossible to figure out which is which. It also uncovers and recovers different syntaxes. Funk is a polyglot that samples and steals and repackages the world in new ways that exhibit its disjunctures and revels in the differences produced by them. And like dancing to Parliament Funkadelic, being immersed in Mehretu's Gesamtkunstwerk is not only pleasurable, but also leaves open the potential of euphoric transformation. However, while we might think of funk as completely free, as completely grounded in a kind of improvisation that eschews pattern or control or rationality, Tony Bolden, the musicologist, reminds us that while we might think of funk as one of the epitomes of free form in Black expression, it is what he calls an alternate form of rationality that has a rhythm and has a sort of way of being. Within this epistemology, the different strands of music, even the pleasure that they enact in dancers and musicians, enact states that have the capacity to lead to the deconstruction of boundaries defined by social status, race, gender, and the like. George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic likens such activities to the moment when different registers come into one rhythm. So you have a lot of things happening all at once, and suddenly you have this moment where everything's like there. Right? Or, in art history, I had a professor who would call that the wow effect, the wow moment. Like you see it and you're like, oh, we're here, wow. All right. Describing the effect to interviewers Tavis Smiley and Cornell West, Clinton referred to the one as the moment when an energy is created that is capable of deconstructing social difference. And he's referring to that wow moment. He's referring exactly to that wow moment. Right? There's a fleeting moment when, for Clinton, we're all together as one, a life form. I'm for you and you for me. We for trees and we for the planet. At the same time, as tempted as we might be to come together as one, and to have our kumbaya moment, or whatever you would like to call it, funk also becomes a strategy of parsing, critiquing, and satirizing the world. And so you have all of these different things that are happening in a funk scenario, sometimes all at once. If there is any moment of resolution, as Clinton suggested, it is at best fleeting. So let's return to Gondwanaland. Here, one can see some pretty funky operations in play. On the canvas, the primordial past, explored by topographic maps and transparent buildings, is caught up in dramatic and arguably joyful gestures of color and paint. An actual place, Gondwanaland was the name given to the southern supercontinent that existed from around 550 until about 150 years ago. Connected with its northern neighbor, Laurasia, the landmass provided for the relatively easy migration of life forms. Gondwanaland eventually broke into pieces, forming Africa, South Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and Australia. Echoing a kind of globalized movement, both with respect to life forms and the land itself, Gondwanaland presents a striking analogy for today's condition of migration and globalization. And it's also a kind of amazing allegory, or flip that around. Mehretu's discussion of the characters and their movement is kind of an amazing analogy for the breaking up of the supercontinents into all of these different not-so-supercontinents. Yet, not only is Back to Gondwanaland an exegesis on a primordial past, it is also a study of the operation of time and memory in the work of Robert Smithson, who, while in the Yucatan in 1969, made two works focused on Gondwanaland. The first, hypothetical, how'd we get there? Here we are, all right? The first, hypothetical ice cap, earth map for Mexico, or Gondwanaland, is a drawing that superimposes the supercontinent over its parts. The second, called Gondwanaland Ice Cap, which you see on the right, made of earth and limestone blocks, only existed after its initial construction in photographs. Far from existing as representations of a physical place, the works demonstrate disjunctures between maps and texts. In the Yucatan, this place of Mayan ruins where, for Smithson, memory is at best the machination of a viewer, Gondwanaland is less historical fact than it is an articulation of absence and denaturization. In the artist's own words, Smithson we were talking about, Gondwanaland is a kind of memory, yet it is not a memory, but it is an incognito landmass that has been unthought about and in turn turned into a map of impasse. You cannot visit Gondwanaland, but you can visit a map of it. Sort of amazing. Working with the past and the present, and working around the specter of Smithson, Mehretu's work is less about absence and less about the impossibility of memory, and less about the displacement of the traveling artist than it is about the mixing of a primordial, imagined past and a global present. Its characters, as she described above, huddle together and create a community. They migrate and mix with other characters. It is as if the operation she described above exists, as I said, as an allegory for the very creation of the continents from which totalizing views of the world have sprung. Like Smithson, she partakes in deconstruction and denaturalization, but unlike him, she imagines Gondwanaland as a space of contradiction and reconstitution. It is a funky psychogeography that partakes in storying, and a play that is at once pleasurable in the way that funk delights in play and the freeing of the mind, and political. Both of these operations are at the base of Mehretu's visual practice, and I would argue that it's also inflected with the kind of operations that we saw with the Situationist International. All of these things, all of these multiple layers of references, and there are more layers too that I just haven't brought up, that come into play. But all of this is to say that if the geographer has power, if the geographer can indeed create and define and construct our understanding of a place, then the artist, and someone like Mehretu, takes up the mantle and she questions and subverts the power of the maker. So that is to say, if we understand maps, right, as having claim to authority, having claim to making and remaking subjects, being a tool of the state, having recourse to science, all of these sorts of things, to create overarching views of the world that construct us as political and social beings, then it is work like this that starts to undo those kinds of operations. All right. So for Mehretu, we can say that she maps space. However, instead of rendering the world legible or readable, which is the function of the map, all right, she creates tableaus of chaos. And in the mediums that close in on and clash with one another, she attacks and questions the art object itself, as well as the things that the art object attends to. In this way, the psychogeographies of Mehretu create ruptures that open up onto other views and other imaginaries. And in this indeterminate space, in these shifting works, they bring us into worlds that leave us wanting, that leave us without knowing quite what to think, what to do, or what to say. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you. I hope you will take some questions.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to put the light up just slightly.
Yeah, no, that's fine. The light is good.
Is that better, or was that too much? Sorry about that, everyone. I tried.
Everyone's like, don't look at me, don't look at me.
But now I can see you. And,
I can see you.
If possible, we'll bring a mic to you if you put your hand up, and we'll bring the mic, then we can make sure the audio is good. So, questions?
Yes.
I wonder, how do you go first? I wonder if you could perhaps take us a little bit into the prehistory of the works that you showed us tonight, earlier, Murata. You talked a lot about the marks in the media.
Yes.
The marks are made in terms of tensions and conflict, but also particularly interesting for me in terms of the syntax. And so I'm wondering, is there a symbology that goes along with these? Is that the choice between color and monochrome, between graphite and paint?
Yeah.
How do all these come together into a language that we are reading?
That's a great question. And in terms of the earliest work, she tended towards drawing in graphite, right, and drawing in ink, and a lot of the works pre, say, 1995 or so are really quite monochromatic. They're smaller, and they look like, the way I would describe those early markings are like weather maps that you would see, the cold front, or the warm spell, or the cloud, or the little marks of precipitation, right? Or like footprints of birds and things like that. And in terms of the prehistory, it's so funny because what I resisted for a really long time was trying to sort of read these things as biographical or as autobiographical, and it was a tendency that she pushed against when people would ask her about it. And so, in interviews that you see, she would just, she'd be asked, because, you're a black artist, of course, this is about your migration. And so she'd always be asked about this movement as a kid, right, from Ethiopia to Michigan. And she would sort of, not say much. And that, for me, provided a way to think about her differently. But then, I'd see these interviews and she'd mention her father. And nothing in detail, but she would just say, oh, well, I was looking at my father, and her father is not an artist, okay? And so, about the 17th time you read this, I thought, well, so what's so great about her father? Whatever. right? And so I, got his name and I looked him up. And if her father is an academic, and her father is an economic geographer who was at Michigan State for like a million years. And so I started reading her father's books. and so her father wrote books on economic geography and the lack of light, on economic geography and Africa. And he was looking in the Horn of Africa in the 1980s. And the what is it's little characters that are spring around. But what was so amazing to me in these books, and I just haven't sort of gotten them in yet, is that they're accompanied by these sort of strange informational graphics, these strange charts that look at different kind of economic factors in the Horn of Africa over time. And I'm looking at these things, and they are indecipherable. These graphics are indecipherable. And he was making them at a time when Mehretu was a kid and a teenager. And so she was around, she was seeing this. And it seems to me that those markings, sort of the memory of those markings, experience around those markings, became some of these characters in her early work. I asked her about it once, and we just started laughing, which meant that I was right. But I think that there is that familial piece there. But in terms of drawing, painting, graphics, she never leaves one medium. And what she would describe in terms of what comes when is that, in a way, now you're sort of moving forward in her career, that painting and the ink work tends to be a respite between painting cycles. And so she'll say, oh, I just finished, this, 73-foot long painting, and now I'm making smaller 17-foot drawings, all right, or doing ink work, or doing these kinds of things, or making etchings. Right? And so they seem to be a kind of, I would say, space clearing gesture, right? Between these sort of grand cycles of painting. Because she thinks, I would say that for her, and I'm sort of speaking for her, or speaking, having looked at her work for so long, I would say that she thinks of painting as an epic activity in the way that we would regard, say, Caravaggio or Poussin as being epic, right? And she looks at them. She's looking at Caravaggio. She's looking at Poussin. She's looking at Baroque art, and she's trying to, I think, sort of inhabit it in an abstract fashion. And so, in terms formally, in a way, you can see, sort of a marriage between, say, Caravaggio and Russian constructivists going on in that work, right? And I think that's fascinating, right? But in terms of, sort of if we can think of a kind of trajectory, because if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like, a little bit of what you're thinking of, and tell me if I'm wrong, is this sort of how did we get here, right? How did we get your moment? And I think in a way it is through these sort of early markings from her father's informational graphics, an attention to architecture, because that moves in and out, and even some of these, Beirut is 2010, right? But even in some of those earlier works, Ruffian Logistics and Stadia, which are 2003, 2004, she's looking at architecture. It is clear. And so the Stadia, in Stadia, she's thinking about being in space, and quite literally being in stadiums, right? And what those mean in terms of spectacle, communities that might be formed for only a soccer match, and the kinds of things that entail, and how can one match that up and think through through paint, through visually, the kinds of things, the kind of interactions that take place, and how can you think about it differently?
Thank you. We've got other questions? That,
yeah, this is maybe more an observation than a question, but there is something striking about her Gesamtkunstwerk, because for me, maps are a synonym of boundaries. And well, her Gesamtkunstwerk are not only, they are monumental, but also endless. I mean, like it goes beyond the frame, and yeah, so, and this juxtaposition of layers open to a large range of possibilities. So I don't know if you can provide an explanation about that tension, maybe?
You're right. You're right. And at times they get even more monumental than, you know, something like this. And so one example, actually I think a really interesting example, are her cycles of paintings from Documenta in 2012. And she had 4 panels, I think they were called Morgama, in 2012 that were based in part upon on the Arab Spring. And she made these 4 panels, and they are massive. And so each of them is probably about 20, 25 feet tall and about 13 or 14 feet across. I was not able to photograph them all, you know, with a single lens. And in those, you know, and I guess the question is, because the sort of complication of layers is always there, right? Even from very early on. I mean, Gondwanaland is 2000, you know, even works from the 1990s. You know, we start to see, you know, this sort of playing around with different kinds of strokes and different kinds of marks. And so even in some of the earlier drawings, you might have lines, you're sort of very controlled lines, juxtaposed with this sort of almost stabbing, you know, the surface with dots or with little tick marks or with something like that. And so I think there's always been this kind of play with multiple registers, right? And I think that is the constant, right? That is always the constant. And so the question within that would, yeah, and I think it's hard to know, right? Well, when do you use color? When do you not use color? And even in some of these 2012 canvases, which are massive, you may only see 1 or 2 strokes of color in the whole piece, right? And so the tension, I think that the tension in part is reliant on context, but in terms of this sort of deconstructive mode that I think that they sort of stage is constant. I think that's consistent, and I think that in part it is around this sort of notion of, or a notion that an undoing of the kind of authority of a map, right, or a diagram, can be seen as a metaphor for the undoing of any number of things in the world. And so I think that on that level it's a political sense.
I'd like to come back to political,
Yeah.
but I will wait for Kat's question.
I'm not quite sure of my question. I'm just kind of curious about your use of funk as an analytic figure. Because as a radical disheveling figure, a way of almost deportment or moving through the city. Because, of course, we're most familiar with funk in its commodity form. Think of the MTV video clip of guys in the car moving through the city, you know, to enact or whatever. But you seem to indicate something a little bit more deconstructive, a little bit more radical in that commodity form that we're used to thinking about funk.
Right.
As an analytic figure, could you elaborate?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I feel like I got there somewhat accidentally, and you know, in the essay that Sarah Lewis published in Callaloo on Murata, the first picture is Greg Tate, the writer and conductor, Greg Tate, with the Brown Sugar Orchestra. And they're playing, and they participate in funk and hip hop and all of these things, right? And kind of free formed, but very controlled. And they were performing in front of one of Murata's paintings. house. And there's this image, I should have put it up on the screen, of all of this going on in front of this band. And I thought, this is really interesting. And so, you know, and I started thinking about how Greg Tate sort of thinks through his music practice. He's also a critic. He's many things. And how that then, how I could think about that in terms of Mehretu, because it's not obvious at all. On so many levels, it's just not obvious. Which maybe is part of why I like it. But I also, you know, it's not jazz. And I'm sort of at war with, like, you know, black people talking about art and jazz. And it's not hip hop. And also I thought about the sort of ascendance of funk in Ethiopian context. There are all of these Ethiopian funk bands that operate in the US. And I thought, well, wait a minute, there is something here, right? And funk itself, I mean, funk occupies this sort of interesting middle ground between what we think of as soul and jazz and all these things, and hip hop. If we think about a bridge between the two, it is funk, and maybe a little less disco. But in its form, and I guess I'm old enough to have been around, you know, before the complete commodification of the art form, you know, back in, you know, in my reckless youth. And in that moment, and, you know, Mehretu's a bit younger than I am, but in that moment, you know, funk was this sort of, you know, polyphonic, huge sort of layering of different syntaxes that seemed to go nowhere yet always took you somewhere. And I think that these are similar in their way. So that's how I got there, and, you know, and I think that, and I also think, and someone said this to me once, a colleague, I was talking with him about this, and he's, you know, a historian. And he said to me, well, because I was like, oh, it's free going and blah, 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 blah. He's like, no, it's really controlling, actually. It's really controlled. As is this work. And so, you know, even the gestures, we think of control and not controlled, but I think of Mehretu as being one of the most controlled artists that I know.
Can I ask a question about going back to scale a little bit and the massiveness of it? And you've talked about in other work about kind of black artists in America dealing with the legacy of a sort of an abstract world which is supposed to sort of kick away things and take the body out, put the line in. But you could almost argue that these giant scale, and even the scale that Bradford uses a lot, is in some ways dealing with a kind of history of American giantism or gigantism in art. But what is different about it, or what does it critique internally? Because British psychogeography went in a very different way.
Right,
so if you take Robert Macfarlane or even Will Self or any of the sort of explicitly post-Debordian, you know, they're going down old pathways and digging down trenches and finding fossils. Whereas this is a very different kind of psychogeography. And I wonder, is it ever possible to sort of tame scale, or will there always be something sort of, you know, fetishistically giant about it? I don't want to come to Robert Hughes. No, about American culture and the use of scale.
Well, we like big things, right? I mean, you know, big houses, big cars, big cities.
I suppose I mean the art world, but yeah.
No, I think that that's such a really interesting comment. In terms of, because and I guess the great irony, as my husband will tell you, is that I like small art. And so like my own art is like tiny. But I think that there's something about, you know, and I don't know if it's something about manifest destiny, you know, the sort of residue of American people and culture moving westward and thinking about space as unending and expansive. And I live in Los Angeles, which, you know, we think of, okay, or for someone like me who's a transplant from the East Coast to LA, where, you know, in the East, you know, things are small, spaces are small, everything is small, and I moved to Los Angeles as like a 20-something, and I'm just like, you know, sort of, I'm gobsmacked because I get out there and I don't understand space anymore. And you know, but one of the myths of the US, right, is unlimited space. And I think that it comes in as a way in which artists, and not just these artists, I mean, we can.
Yeah. But is this a critique from a because you've made arguments about other artists that they are explicitly in African American coded ways actually critiquing this. Is Julie Mehretu involved in that?
I think that Mark is. I think that from Mark, I mean, if you think of Mark Bradford's work, and we can go back actually really far to one of his, I don't know what I just did here. Bye. There we go.
One of the first things you
That,
Yeah.
which is also massive in scale, and not as massive as Murata. But I think that Mark Bradford is much more consciously and much more directly sort of critiquing space and critiquing cities. And if you think about the sort of American policies in cities in the 1990s, the enterprise zone, this and that, he's really sort of digging down, he's drilling down and thinking about the ways in which cities and race sort of interact and are parsed out. I think in Mehretu's case, I think that for some of these artists, and I think that she's one of them, I think they both are, that scale is also a way to intervene, not politically through questioning the sort of tenets of modernist art. I think in part it's about sort of taking on modernism as well. And what happens when you were an artist coming from this standpoint, and I don't think that African American artists have the corner on that work, on that tendency. But what does it mean to sort of take modernism, even take someone like an Agnes Martin, whose own work is not huge, but in Bradford looks at her and suddenly blows up her world, right? Or Robert Ryman, these white paintings, right? And he blows them up. For Mehretu, even if you think about the kind of Baroque over-the-topness that she is invested in, the epic sort of ways in which she would like to think of her work, part of the epicness is scale, right? And so if you blow it up, that suddenly, you know, because as we all know, right, something this size, if you do the same thing that size, it's not just okay, now it's 2 times as big, right? It is big in different ways. It reveals itself in different ways. And I think that, you know, but there are other artists too in that frame, in that setting, who start to think about sort of very large scale work, Yinka Shonibari in a British context, right? You know, they start to blow things up, and I think that it does become a kind of political questioning, both of sort of ourselves in the world, but also of operations of art itself.
I'm sure there must be other questions, reflection. But leave me with this mic, so we stay through.
I see Mark looking at me. So. It's interesting when I think about this work in terms of your wonderful talk, thank you very much, in terms of space, but also in terms of place, and this idea of fracturing, which is quite, it's not uncommon as when we think about diasporic communities.
Right.
And thinking in terms of this relationship with space and place as always being in tension. So her work for me, when I look at it, constantly reminds me of this idea of traversing unknown landscapes. but also in particular in terms of thinking about this idea of emptiness, but also, fullness in terms of, particularly when we think about, for instance, one about the stadium. So there are rings in that work that are obviously related to Olympics. There are 5 rings.
Yes, absolutely.
So, there are various ways in which you can read these works in terms of the familiar and the unfamiliar. But they also startlingly remind me of a number of Indigenous Australian works when we think about mapping space from an aerial perspective, but also in terms of massive scale.
Yes, that's super interesting, and I mean I think one of the sort of elephants in the room, as it were, is the problem of the aerial view, right? And what does the aerial view for some groups signify something far different than it does for others, right? And so what does it mean? And I mean, the Situationists did it one way. I think that artists everywhere, start thinking about and start dealing with the map, and and how it also serves as a record of surveillance. And so the bird's eye view isn't just that we can all see, we can see the land. It's that we can see everything about the land. Right, and it's and I think even someone like a Bradford, he's looking at aerial maps, especially places like Los Angeles, which there's a whole huge archive of aerial views of LA that happen to be on my own campus. And LA is sort of rife for this sort of thinking anyway, because it's vast, it's flat, it's but the aerial view is, I think, something that comes back to what you were talking about situationists and psychogeographies. It is about this sort of exposure, I think is a good way to put it. Like, how does one deal with the constant exposure, or even questions of visibility and invisibility? And I know, unfortunately, know next to nothing about Indigenous art in Australia. But in American painting, right, if one thinks about Native Americans, right, they were so often part of the land, and you would have these massive paintings of the American West, and if Native Americans were in them at all, they were there literally as part of the land, or they were so small that you could barely see them. And so sort of fast forward a century, a lot of work that has emanated from artists who have that ancestry has been really thinking about the connection of the sort of surveillance of subjects, right, and the categorizing of subjects, and notions of personhood, subjectivity. Well, what does it mean to sort of counteract that? What does it mean to recreate it? And I think that we see that much more explicitly in someone like a Bradford, or even Houston Conwell, who's part of this book as well, or Campos Pons, perhaps, than in Murata. But I think what's interesting, I mean, I'm really interested in the ways in which artists of color deal with abstraction, and how at the base, and this has been a question for me since I was a baby grad student, and at the base, sort of wondering what one reads into abstraction, right? If we want to sort of do a formalist take on abstract art, what does that mean for someone like a Mehretu, right? Either from the way that she would characterize her own work, or the way that I would characterize her work, or for someone like a Bradford, whose descriptions of his work shift depending on the show and depending on whom he's talking to. And so, what do you make of that? Or when I was just starting out, I was looking at the work of Norman Lewis, an African American artist who died in the 1970s. But he had these sort of amazing abstract paintings from the 1940s and 1950s that people, back then, we're talking the early 90s, weren't quite sure what to do with, or what does it mean for a black artist to paint abstractly? Or, within black communities, oftentimes, particularly in the late 1960s, the works were ignored. They were thought of as just not socially relevant. And so you have all of that stuff. And I think that it makes it challenging and hugely interesting to start trying to figure out what that looks like.
I'm sure some of that will come up in tomorrow's seminar. Is there another woman painter who technically is a draftsman and painter working at such scale currently?
Not that I can think of, which doesn't mean there isn't one.
I mean, I'm trying to think of. I was trying to think of because that's a question we haven't asked. What's the psychogeographical movement has been much criticised by feminists,
right,
who feel that it's a sort of ghastly extension of Baudelairean flânerie, made into yet another male dominance of the. And here you're arguing for a woman artist fully in charge of a kind of epic scale psychogeography.
Absolutely.
Is she a lone figure?
She might be. And I haven't thought about it. She might be. But what I can think of are art historians who feminist art historians who have sort of started thinking about the maleness of geography. Rosalind Deutsch, for example, who does a wonderful job at sussing out. She looks at the work of Derek Gregory, who wrote a book in the mid-90s called Geographical Imagination. And Deutsch comes in and she starts talking about what that means and how feminism interacts and problematizes what she would call a boys' town of geographers and the like. Yeah.
Okay, I realise 7:30 is ticking on. This is when we tend to get kicked out of whatever room we're in. So I would like to thank Stephen very much. Please come back tomorrow, all students and staff who want to come to our lunchtime seminar to pursue some of these conversations tomorrow at 12 in the Schaefer seminar room. But for now, thank you so much, Stephen.